The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence's house as Camilla sat in her private sitting room, staring at the formal letter that had arrived with the royal courier. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the words again, each sentence feeling like a blade cutting deeper into her heart. The letter bore the official seal of the crown, but the message was deeply personal and devastating. Charles had made his decision. After months of heated discussions behind closed doors, he had chosen duty over love, tradition over compassion. The letter outlined new protocols that would effectively ban Camilla's family from participating in any future royal events, ceremonies, or gatherings. Her children, Tom and Laura, her grandchildren, her sister Annabelle, none of them would be welcome in the circles that had become Camilla's world. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had fought so hard to gain acceptance into the royal family, weathering decades of public scrutiny, media attacks, and whispered criticisms. She had endured being called the other woman, the marriage wrecker, the woman who could never be queen. Yet through it all, Charles had stood by her side, promising that their love would conquer all obstacles. He had assured her that once they were married, once she became his queen consort, things would be different. But palace politics ran deeper than personal promises. The recent scandals involving other royal family members had created a climate of extreme caution. The king's advisors had convinced him that any association with controversy, no matter how distant, could damage the monarchy's carefully rebuilt reputation. Camilla's past, her previous marriage, and even her family's occasional media appearances had been scrutinized and found wanting by those who guarded the crown's image. The decision had been presented to Charles as a choice between his personal happiness and his duty to the realm. The advisors painted a picture of potential disaster if Camilla's family remained integrated into royal life. They spoke of media attention, of uncomfortable questions, of the need to present a unified and uncontroversial front to the public. In their view, Camilla herself was acceptable. She had proven her worth and commitment, but her extended family represented a liability that could no longer be tolerated. Camilla remembered the conversation from 3 nights ago. Charles had paced their private quarters like a caged animal, his face etched with anguish. He had explained the impossible position he found himself in, torn between his love for her and his responsibility to the institution he now led. The advisors had made it clear that this was not a request but a necessity for the stability of the crown. She had listened in stunned silence as he outlined the new restrictions. Tom and Laura would no longer receive invitations to state functions. Her grandchildren would not be included in royal Christmas celebrations or Easter gatherings. Family holidays that had become precious traditions would be divided, with Camilla forced to choose between her royal duties and her maternal instincts. The cruelest part was the timing. Just as Camilla had begun to feel truly accepted, just as she had started to believe that she had earned her place not just as Charles's wife, but as a valued member of the royal family, the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The very family members who had supported her through the difficult years of public criticism were now being cast aside as inconvenient reminders of her complicated past. Charles had tried to soften the blow, speaking of it as a temporary measure, something that might be revisited in the future when the political climate improved. But Camilla knew better. Royal decisions once made and formalized rarely changed. The letter in her hands was not just a policy change. It was a permanent severing of ties between her two worlds. She thought of her daughter Laura, who had been planning to introduce her newborn son at the upcoming family gathering. She thought of Tom, who had always maintained a respectful distance from the media while supporting his mother's new life. Neither of them deserved to be punished for her choices, yet they were bearing the consequences of her journey to the throne. The sitting room felt smaller than usual, the walls seeming to close in as the weight of the decision settled upon her. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of palace life continuing, staff going about their duties, guards changing shifts, the distant hum of traffic from the London streets beyond the gates. But inside, her world had fundamentally changed. Camilla had always prided herself on being a survivor, someone who could weather any storm and emerge stronger. She had endured public humiliation, personal attacks, and the constant pressure of living under intense scrutiny. But this felt different. This was not an attack from outsiders or critics. This was betrayal from within, from the very institution she had sacrificed so much to join. The letter concluded with formal language about the decision being in the best interests of the crown and its subjects. It spoke of difficult choices being necessary for the greater good. But between the official phrases, Camilla could read the truth. She had been deemed acceptable, but her family had not. She could remain in the golden cage of royalty, but only if she was willing to close the door on those she loved most. As she folded the letter carefully, her mind began to race with questions and implications. How would she explain this to her children? How could she attend royal functions knowing that her family was deliberately excluded? How could she look at Charles across the dinner table, knowing that he had chosen the crown over her heart's deepest needs? The morning sun had shifted, and the shadows in the room had grown longer. Soon she would need to put on her public face, attend to her royal duties, and pretend that her world had not just fundamentally shifted. But for now, in the privacy of her sitting room, Camilla allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had been taken from her, and what the price of her crown would truly cost. The crystal chandelier above the dining room table cast dancing shadows as Camilla waited for Charles to return from his afternoon engagements. She had spent the day in a haze of royal duties, opening a children's hospital, meeting with charity representatives, and smiling for photographs while her heart felt like it was breaking. Each public appearance had been torture, knowing that the very people who should have been celebrating these moments with her had been officially banished from her life. When Charles finally entered their private quarters, his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. The weight of the crown was visible in every line of his face, but Camilla felt no sympathy. The anger that had been building throughout the day erupted as soon as he closed the door behind him. She confronted him immediately, her voice shaking with fury and pain. How could he have signed such a document without even discussing it with her first? How could he have made a decision that would tear apart everything she held dear outside of their marriage? The questions poured out of her like water from a broken dam, each one carrying years of suppressed frustration and fear. Charles tried to explain, his voice weary and defensive. He spoke of the impossible pressures he faced, of advisors who painted catastrophic pictures of what might happen if the royal family appeared to have any controversial connections. The recent scandals involving other royals had made everyone paranoid about public perception. Every decision was being scrutinized, every relationship analyzed for potential damage to the monarchy's reputation. But Camilla would not be placated by talk of duty and necessity. She reminded him of the promises he had made during their courtship and early marriage. He had sworn that they would face everything together, that her family would become his family, that love would triumph over protocol. She had believed him when he said that once she was his wife, once she had proven her worth to the institution, things would be different. The argument escalated as Charles became more defensive about his position. He tried to make her understand the political realities of their situation. The monarchy was not just a family. It was an institution that represented the entire nation. Every decision had to be weighed against its potential impact on public trust and confidence. Her family, through no fault of their own, had become a liability that threatened the careful balance he was trying to maintain. Camilla's response was fierce and uncompromising. She accused him of cowardice, of hiding behind advisors and protocols instead of standing up for what was right. She had sacrificed everything for this marriage, her privacy, her peace of mind, her relationship with the public. And now he was asking her to sacrifice her children and grandchildren as well. Where would it end? What would be the next demand from the faceless advisors who seemed to control every aspect of their lives? The conversation revealed the fundamental tension that had always existed in their relationship, but had been carefully ignored. Charles saw himself as a servant of the crown first and a husband second. Every personal decision had to be filtered through the lens of what was best for the monarchy. Camilla, despite years of royal training, still thought like a mother and grandmother first. The idea of deliberately excluding her loved ones from her life was not just painful, it was unthinkable. As the evening wore on, their argument became more personal and bitter. Camilla accused Charles of being manipulated by advisors who had never liked her, and had been looking for ways to diminish her influence. She suggested that this decision was not really about protecting the monarchy, but about punishing her for her past, and reminding her of her place in the royal hierarchy. Charles, stung by her accusations, responded with unusual harshness. He reminded her of the journey they had traveled together, of how hard he had fought to make their marriage possible. He had defied his mother, weathered public criticism, and changed centuries of tradition to make her his queen. But with privilege came responsibility, and sometimes that responsibility required painful sacrifices. The argument reached its climax when Camilla demanded that Charles choose between the advisor's demands and his marriage. If he could not stand up for her family, if he could not keep the promises he had made, then what was the point of their union? She had not fought for decades to become queen, only to discover that the crown came with chains that bound not just her, but everyone she loved. Charles's response shattered something fundamental between them. He told her that he could not unmake the decision, that it was not just his choice alone, but the collective wisdom of the institution he served. The crown was bigger than both of them, bigger than their personal desires or family bonds. If she could not accept that reality, then perhaps she had never truly understood what it meant to be queen. The words hung in the air like poison. For the first time in their long relationship, Camilla saw Charles not as her devoted husband, but as the king who had chosen duty over love. The man who had once promised to cherish and protect her family had transformed into a monarch who saw them as expendable pawns in a larger game. The silence that followed was deafening. Both of them realized that something irrevocable had happened, that their relationship had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The romantic narrative of their love story, the tale of two people who had overcome every obstacle to be together, had collided with the harsh reality of institutional power and political necessity. As Charles left the room, claiming he needed time to think, Camilla remained alone with the wreckage of her hopes and dreams. The argument had clarified what she had been trying to deny. Her position in the royal family was conditional, dependent on her willingness to sacrifice everything else she held dear. She had won the battle to become queen, but she was losing the war for her soul. The palace around her felt more like a prison than a home. The luxury and privilege that surrounded her seemed hollow when weighed against the cost of maintaining them. She had gained a crown but was losing her family, and for the first time since her wedding day, Camilla began to question whether the price she had paid was worth what she had received in return. The phone calls Camilla had been dreading could no longer be postponed. 3 days had passed since her confrontation with Charles, and the formal notifications were already being sent out. Royal secretaries were quietly canceling invitations and removing names from guest lists. Soon her family would start receiving official letters explaining why they were no longer welcome at royal events. She knew she had to tell them herself before they learned about it through cold, impersonal correspondence. She decided to call Laura first. Her daughter had always been her closest confidant, the one person who understood the sacrifices and challenges of having a mother in the royal family. As the phone rang, Camilla's hands shook slightly, dreading the conversation that would break her daughter's heart and possibly destroy their relationship forever. Laura answered cheerfully, immediately asking about plans for the upcoming christening of her newborn son, James. She had been looking forward to the traditional royal blessing, to having her son recognized as part of the extended royal family. The excitement in her daughter's voice made what Camilla had to say even more painful. The words came out in a rush, as if speaking quickly would somehow lessen their impact. Camilla explained about the new protocols, about the decision to limit royal events to immediate family members only, about how the advisors had convinced Charles that this was necessary for the stability of the monarchy. She tried to make it sound like a temporary adjustment, something that might change in the future, but Laura was too intelligent to be fooled by diplomatic language. The silence on the other end of the phone was devastating. When Laura finally spoke, her voice was flat and cold, stripped of its usual warmth. She wanted to know if Camilla had fought for them, if she had stood up to Charles and the advisors who were making these decisions. The questions cut deep because Camilla knew she had not fought hard enough, had not been willing to risk her own position to protect her family. Laura's pain quickly transformed into anger. She accused her mother of choosing the crown over her own children, of becoming so intoxicated by royal privilege that she was willing to abandon the people who had supported her through the darkest times. The christening was cancelled, but more than that. Laura made it clear that if the royal family did not want her or her children, then perhaps it was time for a complete separation. The call to Tom was equally devastating, but in a different way. Her son listened quietly as she explained the situation, asking few questions but absorbing every word. When she finished, he simply said that he understood and that she should not worry about him. But Camilla knew her son well enough to hear the hurt beneath his controlled response. Tom had always been protective of his mother's reputation, careful never to do anything that might embarrass her or create negative headlines. To be told that his mere existence was now seen as a liability was a betrayal that cut to his core. The conversation with her sister Annabelle was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. Annabelle had been Camilla's rock throughout the years of public criticism and media scrutiny. She had attended every important event, stood by her sister's side through every crisis, and celebrated every triumph. To tell her that she was no longer welcome in Camilla's royal life felt like cutting off her own arm. Annabelle's response was typical of her practical nature. She told Camilla not to worry about her, that she would be fine, that she understood the pressures of royal life. But beneath the supportive words, Camilla could hear the devastation. Annabelle had been looking forward to her granddaughter's upcoming debut at a royal charity function. Now that event would happen without any family members present to share in Camilla's pride and joy. Each phone call left Camilla more isolated and heartbroken. The people who knew her best, who had loved her before she became a royal, were being systematically removed from her life. She was discovering that being queen meant being alone in ways she had never imagined. The crown that had seemed like the ultimate prize was revealing itself to be a beautiful prison. The hardest part was explaining the situation to her grandchildren. How could she tell young children that they were no longer welcome at grandmother's house for special occasions? How could she explain that their presence was somehow harmful to the institution she represented? The innocence in their voices when they asked about upcoming visits broke her heart in ways that no amount of public criticism ever had. As word of the new restrictions spread through her family, Camilla began to see the broader implications of what was happening. Family gatherings would be divided, with some members attending royal events while others were excluded. Holiday traditions would be broken. The natural flow of family life would be disrupted by artificial barriers created by protocol and political necessity. The isolation became more pronounced when Charles refused to discuss the matter further. He had made his decision and considered the case closed. When Camilla tried to bring up specific instances, her grandson's birthday party, her daughter's anniversary celebration, Charles would simply remind her that these were personal matters that could not involve royal participation. The divide between her public and private life had become an unbridgeable chasm. Palace staff began treating her differently as well. They could sense the tension and uncertainty surrounding the new restrictions. Servants who had grown fond of her family members during their visits now avoided discussing them altogether. The warm, familial atmosphere that had slowly developed at royal residences was replaced by a cold professionalism that reminded everyone of the institutional nature of their relationships. The media began to notice the absences. Royal correspondents who had grown accustomed to seeing Camilla's family at major events started asking questions about their sudden invisibility. Palace press secretaries deflected inquiries with vague statements about evolving protocols and scheduling conflicts. But the more perceptive journalists sensed a larger story brewing beneath the surface. Camilla found herself living a double life more completely than ever before. In public, she continued to fulfill her royal duties with grace and dignity, smiling for cameras and engaging with the public as if nothing had changed. But privately, she was grieving the loss of the family connections that had sustained her through the challenges of royal life. The people who had helped her maintain her sense of self were being erased from her world, leaving her more dependent than ever on an institution that viewed her as replaceable. The realization that she was truly alone in her golden cage was settling in, and with it came a profound sadness that no amount of royal privilege could ease. The red carpet stretched endlessly before her, lined with photographers whose cameras flashed like lightning in a manufactured storm. Camilla walked with practiced grace, her smile perfect and unwavering, her posture regal and confident. To the watching world, she was the picture of royal contentment, a queen consort who had found her place in the monarchy and was thriving in her role. But beneath the designer gown and carefully applied makeup, Her heart was breaking with each step. This was her first major public appearance since the family restrictions had been implemented, and every moment felt like a performance of the highest stakes. The charity gala was one of her patronage events, something she genuinely cared about. But even her passion for the cause felt muted by the knowledge that none of her family would be there to share in her accomplishments. In the past, she would have caught Laura's eye in the audience during her speech, would have seen Tom's proud smile from across the room, would have felt the warmth of their support even in the most formal of settings. Now, she was surrounded by courtiers, officials, and strangers who smiled and applauded on cue, but felt no genuine connection to her success or happiness. The isolation was suffocating, made worse by the need to pretend that everything was perfect. Royal protocol demanded that she never show weakness, never reveal the personal costs of her position, never let the public see behind the carefully constructed facade of monarchical serenity. During her speech, Camilla spoke passionately about the importance of family support in times of crisis, about the need for strong community bonds to help people through difficult periods. The irony was not lost on her. She was advocating for the very thing that had been stripped from her own life. Every word felt like it was cutting her throat, but she delivered the message with conviction because it was what the audience needed to hear, what her role demanded she say. The questions from journalists after the event were particularly challenging. Several reporters had noticed the absence of her family members from recent royal events and pressed for explanations. Camilla deflected with practiced skill, speaking vaguely about evolving family commitments and busy schedules. But she could see the skepticism in their eyes, could sense that they suspected a larger story was hidden. Beneath her diplomatic responses, one persistent reporter asked directly about whether there had been any changes in protocol regarding extended royal family members. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Camilla felt the weight of dozens of cameras and recording devices focused on her response. She smiled graciously and spoke about the natural evolution of royal traditions, about how each generation found its own way to balance public duty with private life. The non-answer satisfied no one, but it was all she could give without breaking the codes of discretion that governed royal communication. Behind the scenes, palace staff worked overtime to manage the narrative. Press releases emphasized Camilla's growing confidence in her role, her expanding list of patronages, her deepening relationship with Charles. Photos were carefully selected to show her looking radiant and fulfilled, engaged in meaningful work and surrounded by adoring crowds. The image being crafted was of a woman who had found her perfect place in the world and wanted for nothing. But those who knew her well could see the strain. Her lady-in-waiting noticed that Camilla's appetite had decreased, that she seemed distracted during briefings, that her famous resilience appeared to be wearing thin. The queen consort, who had once faced down hostile crowds and devastating headlines with unflinching courage, was struggling to maintain her composure. In private moments between public appearances, the most difficult part of maintaining the facade was pretending that her relationship with Charles was unchanged. They appeared together at official events, walked hand in hand, exchanged loving glances for the cameras. But the easiness that had characterized their public interactions was gone, replaced by a careful choreography that masked the tension between them. Every public display of affection felt rehearsed. Every shared laugh seemed forced. Charles, for his part, was dealing with his own guilt about the situation. He could see the toll the restrictions were taking on Camilla, could observe the way she flinched when family-related questions arose in public settings. But he was trapped by his own position, unable to reverse a decision that had been presented to him as essential for the stability of his reign. The weight of the crown was heavier than he had anticipated, and the personal costs were mounting in ways he had not foreseen. Their joint appearances became exercises in diplomatic theater. They would arrive together, smile for the cameras, and perform their roles with professional precision. But observers with trained eyes could detect the subtle signs of strain, the way Camilla's smile faltered when she thought no one was watching, the protective distance Charles maintained even when they were supposed to be displaying intimacy, the careful choreography that prevented any unscripted moments of genuine emotion. The palace's strategy of focusing attention on Camilla's charitable work was partially successful in diverting media attention from family matters, but it came at a personal cost. She threw herself into her royal duties with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, accepting more engagements than her staff recommended, staying longer at events than protocol required. The work became a refuge from the emptiness of her personal life, but it also meant that she was constantly performing, constantly on, with no respite from the demands of her public role. Social media added another layer of complexity to maintaining the facade. Every photo from royal events was analyzed and dissected by online commentators who noticed every detail. The absence of family members was noted and discussed, leading to speculation and conspiracy theories that the palace could not directly address without giving the story more attention. Camilla found herself trapped between the need to maintain privacy and the reality that in the digital age, nothing remained secret for long. The strain of living this double life began to show in unexpected ways. During a routine engagement at a school, a young child asked Camilla about her grandchildren, innocently wondering if they would visit the school as well. The question, so simple and natural, nearly broke her composure entirely. She managed to deflect with a joke about busy family schedules, but those who knew her could see the pain that flickered across her features. As weeks turned into months, the weight of pretending that nothing had changed became almost unbearable. Camilla was discovering that being royal meant being perpetually alone, even in crowds, even surrounded by staff and officials whose job it was to support her. The crown that had once symbolized love triumphant now felt like a burden that was slowly crushing her spirit, one public appearance at a time. The breaking point came on what should have been one of the happiest days of Camilla's royal life. Her grandson James was celebrating his first birthday, a milestone that any grandmother would want to commemorate with joy and celebration. In the past, such family occasions had been private affairs that provided respite from the demands of public life. Now even these personal moments were tainted by the restrictions that governed her existence. Camilla sat in her private study, staring at the birthday invitation that had arrived from Laura. The card featured a photo of James taking his first steps, his face bright with the wonder and innocence that only small children possess. Laura had written a personal note inside, carefully neutral in tone but clearly hoping that her mother might find a way to attend despite the new protocols. The invitation was both a gesture of love and a test of where Camilla's loyalties truly lay. For weeks, she had been trying to find a compromise, a way to attend her grandson's birthday without violating the restrictions that Charles had agreed to. She had suggested a private visit, separate from any official royal recognition. She had proposed attending as a private citizen rather than as queen consort. Every suggestion had been quietly vetoed by the palace machinery that now controlled every aspect of her life. The final blow came when Charles's private secretary informed her that even a personal visit would be inadvisable, as photographs might surface that would create uncomfortable questions about the consistency of royal policy. The suggestion was made that she might send a gift and a personal note instead, maintaining her love for her grandson while respecting the boundaries that had been established for the greater good of the monarchy. That night, alone in her bedroom, Camilla finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had lost. The tears came in waves, years of suppressed grief and frustration pouring out in the darkness. She had sacrificed so much to become queen, her privacy, her peace of mind, her relationship with the public, and now she was being asked to sacrifice her role as a grandmother as well. The price of the crown was proving to be higher than she had ever imagined possible. She thought about the promises Charles had made during their courtship and early marriage. He had sworn that their love would overcome every obstacle, that once she was his wife, once she had proven herself worthy of the royal family, everything would be different. He had painted pictures of a future where she would be accepted and cherished, where her family would become his family, where love would triumph over protocol and tradition. Those promises now felt like cruel deceptions. Charles had not deliberately lied to her, but he had not understood the true nature of the institution he would inherit. The monarchy was not just a family business that could be modified to accommodate personal preferences. It was a system of traditions, expectations, and political necessities that consumed everything in its path. Personal happiness was always secondary to institutional stability, and family bonds meant nothing when weighed against the perceived needs of the crown. The realization that she had been naive about the true costs of royal life was devastating. Camilla had believed that her years of preparation, Her careful cultivation of public acceptance and her genuine commitment to royal duty would be enough to secure a place for her loved ones in her new world. She had not understood that acceptance came with conditions that could change at any moment, that her position was always contingent on her willingness to sacrifice everything else she valued. The isolation she felt was complete and overwhelming. Charles had retreated into his royal duties, using the demands of kingship as an excuse to avoid discussing the personal consequences of his decisions. The staff who surrounded her were professional and courteous, but ultimately loyal to the institution, rather than to her as an individual. She had no confidants within the palace walls, no one who understood or sympathized with her position. Even worse was the growing distance from her own family. The phone calls were becoming less frequent and more strained. Laura's initial anger had settled into a cold disappointment that was somehow more painful than rage. Tom maintained his supportive facade but clearly felt betrayed by his mother's inability to protect him from institutional rejection. Annabelle tried to be understanding, but even she seemed to be pulling away, perhaps sensing that continued closeness would only cause more pain for everyone involved. The breaking point crystallized when Camilla received a call from her daughter-in-law, asking if she would be attending James's birthday party. The hope in the younger woman's voice, the assumption that surely a grandmother would find a way to be present for such an important milestone, shattered something fundamental in Camilla's heart. She had to explain that she would not be there, that royal protocol prevented her attendance, that her love for her grandson was not enough to overcome the institutional barriers that now governed her life. The conversation ended with polite understanding, but Camilla knew that something irrevocable had been damaged. She was becoming a stranger to her own family, a figure who existed in their lives only through carefully worded letters and expensive gifts sent through intermediaries. The warm, hands-on grandmother she had always been was being replaced by a distant royal figure who observed important moments from afar. That night, Camilla made a decision that would change everything. She could not continue living this divided life, pretending that the restrictions were acceptable while her heart was breaking with each missed family moment. She could not continue to smile for cameras while grieving the loss of the relationships that had sustained her through decades of public scrutiny. She decided to force a confrontation with Charles, to demand that he choose between the advisors who were destroying her family connections and the wife who had sacrificed everything to stand beside him. The conversation would either restore some measure of humanity to their royal existence or reveal the true nature of what their marriage had become under the weight of the crown. The palace around her felt more oppressive than ever as she prepared for what might be the most important conversation of her life. The luxury and privilege that surrounded her seemed hollow when measured against the cost of maintaining them. She had gained a throne but was losing her soul, and something had to give before the contradiction destroyed everything she had left to value. The birthday invitation still lay on her desk, a reminder of the choice that would define the rest of her life. Would she continue to be queen at any cost? Or would she find the courage to demand that being royal did not require being inhuman? The confrontation Camilla had been planning came sooner than expected when she discovered Charles in his private office, signing yet another document that would further restrict her family's access to royal events. This time it was a protocol revision that would prevent her from using any royal residences for private family gatherings, effectively ensuring that her grandchildren would never again play in the gardens where she had hoped to watch them grow up. Her composure, carefully maintained for months, finally shattered completely. The accumulated weight of losses, disappointments, and betrayals erupted in a torrent of words that had been building since that first devastating letter. She accused Charles of cowardice, of hiding behind advisors and protocols instead of fighting for the people who mattered most. She reminded him of every promise he had broken, every assurance that had proven hollow, every moment when he had chosen institutional loyalty over personal love. Charles responded with equal intensity, but his anger was different. It was the rage of a man who felt trapped by circumstances beyond his control. He shouted about the impossible pressures of kingship, about decisions that had to be made for the greater good even when they caused personal pain. He accused Camilla of being naive about the realities of royal life, of expecting the monarchy to bend to her personal preferences when it was his job to serve something larger than their individual desires. The argument escalated beyond anything they had ever experienced. Years of suppressed tensions finally exploding into the open. Camilla demanded to know when he had stopped being her husband and become only a king. Charles countered by asking when she had stopped understanding that being queen meant serving something greater than herself. Neither had answers that could bridge the chasm that had opened between them. The fight reached its climax when Camilla issued an ultimatum that surprised even her. She told Charles that she would not continue to live as half a person, cutting off her family to preserve an institution that viewed her as expendable. Either he would find a way to restore her family connections, or she would find a way to restore her humanity without him. The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and final. Charles's response revealed the true depth of how the crown had changed him. He told her that the monarchy had survived for 1,000 years by placing duty above personal desire, that queens throughout history had made far greater sacrifices for far less recognition. If she could not accept the costs of the position she had fought so hard to achieve, then perhaps she had never truly been worthy of wearing the crown. The cruelty of his words was devastating, but also clarifying. In that moment, Camilla saw clearly what her marriage had become and what her future would hold if she continued on the same path. She would become increasingly isolated from everyone she loved, increasingly dependent on an institution that viewed her as a useful symbol rather than a human being with needs and desires of her own. Over the following days, Camilla began to make plans that she had never thought she would need to consider. She spoke quietly with trusted legal advisors about her options, about what it would mean to step back from royal duties, about whether it was possible to remain married to Charles while refusing to continue as his queen consort. The conversations were delicate and dangerous. Even discussing such possibilities could be seen as treason against the crown. The breakthrough came when she realized that she did have one form of leverage that the advisors had not considered. The public genuinely liked her. After years of negative press and criticism, she had finally won over the hearts of the British people through her genuine warmth, her dedication to charitable causes, and her obvious devotion to Charles. Her approval ratings were higher than many senior royals, and her departure would create exactly the kind of negative publicity that the advisors were so desperate to avoid. Camilla's final decision was both simple and revolutionary. She would attend her grandson's birthday party. She would do so as a private citizen, without any royal protocol or security beyond what was necessary for basic safety. If Charles wanted to punish her for choosing family over duty, he would have to do so publicly, in front of a nation that had grown to respect and admire their queen consort. The morning of James's first birthday, Camilla dressed in a simple blue dress that Laura had given her years before. She left behind the designer clothes, the royal jewels, and the carefully crafted public persona that had become her prison. For the first time in months, she looked in the mirror and saw herself rather than a royal figure playing a role. Charles discovered her plans only when she was already in the car, heading toward Laura's house. His phone calls were frantic, desperate, filled with threats about the consequences of her actions and pleadings for her to reconsider. The palace machinery went into crisis mode, with advisors scrambling to manage a situation they had never anticipated. The queen consort had gone rogue and no one knew how to stop her. At the birthday party, surrounded by her family for the first time in months, Camilla felt a peace that had been missing from her life since the restrictions began. She watched James take his tentative first steps across the garden, helped him blow out his single birthday candle, and felt the simple joy of being a grandmother without the weight of royal protocol crushing every moment of happiness. The photographs that appeared in the press the next day showed a woman transformed. Gone was the careful royal composure, replaced by genuine laughter and unguarded affection. The images of Camilla playing with her grandson, hugging her daughter, and simply being human resonated with a public that had grown weary of the artificial perfection that characterized most royal coverage. The palace's response was swift and predictable. A statement was issued explaining that the queen consort had attended a private family gathering in her personal capacity, separate from her royal duties. But the damage to their narrative of controlled institutional loyalty was already done. Camilla had shown that it was possible to be royal while remaining human, and the contrast with the cold protocols that usually governed royal behavior was stark and damaging. Charles was forced to choose between publicly punishing his wife for showing love to her family or accepting that some boundaries could not be crossed, even in service to the crown. The Advisors who had seemed so powerful and certain in their recommendations suddenly appeared uncertain and out of touch when confronted with the reality of public opinion and basic human decency. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes began to appear in royal protocols. Family members who had been banned from events began receiving carefully worded invitations to selected functions. The restrictions were not entirely lifted, but they were relaxed enough to allow for the basic human connections that Camilla had been willing to sacrifice her position to preserve. Camilla had discovered that even queens could rebel, that institutional power had limits when confronted with genuine human courage. She had chosen love over duty, family over protocol, and in doing so had forced the monarchy to remember that it was, ultimately, a human institution serving human needs. The cost of her rebellion was real. Her relationship with Charles would never be the same, and her position within the royal hierarchy was permanently altered. But she had saved her soul and preserved the connections that made life worth living. Sometimes she had learned the only way to keep a crown was to be willing to lose it. Her spirit, which had been slowly shattering under the weight of impossible choices, began to heal. She had found a way to be both royal and human, both queen and grandmother. The path forward would not be easy, but it would be authentic, and that was worth more than all the protocol and privilege in the world.